Today we'll be looking at bankruptcy filing trends by chapter in the state of Kansas. To do this, we have about a dozen charts showing bankruptcy activity in the state going back to 1990. All of this filing data comes from the Administrative Office of the United States Courts. Now, this first chart shows total filings by year since 1990 in the state. And during this period, there have been a total of 285,000 cases filed in Kansas. In the early 1990s, filings were running around 8,000 or 9,000 per year. From 1996 to 2000, they were in the 12,000 range. By 2002 to 2004, this had jumped up to 15,000 or 16,000 per year. 2005 was the year of bankruptcy reform, and with the surge in filings, it hit the all-time peak in Kansas, followed by a more than 70% drop the next year. And then filings increased from 2006 to 2010, but they never got back to anywhere close to where they'd been prior to bankruptcy reform, the whole period from 97 to 2004. And then since then, filings have dropped back again and are well below where they were in 1990, where most states are about where they are, but were back then. But Kansas is well below that level, and they're less than one half of where they were in the years just prior to bankruptcy reform. This map shows filings relative to population over the period from 1990 to 2015. The red states are the states that have the highest bankruptcy rates, and Tennessee is the perennial leader in that. And the yellow are the states that have very low bankruptcy rates, and a lot of states in the Northeast, but Alaska generally has the lowest rate in the country. Kansas has been very close to average at just 3% below average over this entire period of time. If we look at it year by year, you can see that from 1990 to 2004, Kansas was very close to the national average almost every year, a few years above, a few years below. From 2007 to 2015, Kansas, the blue line here, has averaged about 15% below the national average. So they've gone from being about average to somewhat below average in the recent past decade or so. This next chart shows total Chapter 7 filings, and it's very much the same pattern as what we saw for total filings, around 7,000 cases per year in the early 1990s, 8 to 10,000 in the late 90s, increases up to around 13,000 by 2004, then the spike in the year of bankruptcy reform, followed by nearly 80% drop the next year. Increases through the Great Recession, but didn't get anywhere near where filings had been prior to bankruptcy reform. And then filings are down by nearly one half since then, and are basically well below where they were in 1990, and probably only 1/3 or so where they were prior to bankruptcy reform. Chapter 11 filings in the state, you can see that they dropped off very severely throughout the 1990s, and that happened pretty much everywhere nationwide. Since then, there have been about 25 to 50 cases filed per year most years, with some exceptions during recessions, particularly the Great Recession, were bigger. Also, 2016 will be a very high year because there'll be about more than 100 Chapter 11s filed in this state, but about 70 of those are related in the Hammond's Hotel cases. So without that, there'd be about 30 cases for the year. Looking at Chapter 12 cases, throughout the 1990s, the overall average was about 30 per year. There's some disruption from 2000 to 2004 when during certain periods, Chapter 12 wasn't available, although certainly from 2001 to 2003, Kansas had a fair amount again. And then it's averaged about 15 per year since 2005. It certainly dropped off in 14 and 15, but it looks like it'll be back up to about 20 in 2016. Chapter 13 cases in the state. The early 90s were running around 1,500. From 95 to about 02, they're running 2,000 to 3,000 per year. Got over 3,000 in 2003 to 2005. Drop off in 2006, which most states had. Went back up during the recession, but not quite to the peak. And then have only fallen off a little bit since then. Nationally, Chapter 13s are down by about a third, but it's only 10 to 15% decline in Kansas at that time. And so in 2015, the Chapter 13s in Kansas really weren't too far from peak levels, and were well above where they had been, say, back in 1990. Nearly double that period, which is a larger increase than most other states have had over this long period of time. If we look at the percent of cases filed as Chapter 13s, the national, which is this red line, has been right around 30% for several decades, with some disruption before and after bankruptcy reform. If you look at Kansas throughout the 90s and up until 2005, they were running closer to 20% per year. But then since then, Kansas has the percentage of cases that are filed as Chapter 13 has increased in the state, and is now over 40% in Kansas, and well above the national average. So that the case mix has really changed over the last couple of decades in Kansas, much more so than in most other states. This next chart shows the unemployment rate by quarter in Kansas as kind of a proxy for how the economy is going, and going back to 2006. You can see from 2006, 2007, they're pretty close to the national average. This blue line follows Kansas during that time. You can see that during the recession, where the national went up to 10% and was above 9% for several years, it kind of topped off around 7% in Kansas. And then both the national and Kansas have come down in recent years, and so they're now in the 4 to 5% range. Bankruptcy filings peaked nationwide most recently in the year ended September of 2010, and have dropped for the last 6 years. During that time, the total decline has been from the peak has been 49% nationwide. On this map, it shows the states colored red have had the largest declines of over 60%, particularly most of New England and in the Southwest, and Nevada and California are the real leaders in this, where the declines are over about 70%. The smallest declines have been mainly throughout the Southeast, but even here, most of them are down around 30 to 40% over time. And in Kansas, the decline has been a little below average at 43% over time. Looking at how this decline has worked over time, the red line shows the national quarter by quarter, and you can see that for a number of years it was running in the 10 to 15% range each quarter, and over the last year and a half, the rate of decline has slowed down, and Kansas has followed the national fairly closely throughout this period, maybe a little bit less in the 2013 range, and but it's kind of an unclear pattern right now of where things might go. If we look in the first 6 months of the year, the national was down around 6%, and Kansas was a little over 8%. In the third quarter, Kansas actually showed a slight increase, and and we may see a few more quarters like this. But I think that by the end of 2017, there should be an increase just about every quarter. Overall, I think that there'll be about 6,500 cases filed in the state this year, small increases in coming years, And we can see that about a dozen states, the ones colored red here, are already showing increases. And 2 years ago, there wouldn't have been any states colored red. In fact, most would have been colored white, where they were going down more than 10%. But the places where filings are still going down, they're going down at a slower rate. And I expect all of them, or just about all, including Kansas, to jump into actual increases sometime in the next year or so. So about 6,500 in 2016, small increases in 17 and 18. I don't see any return to the 15 or 16,000 cases per year that were filed from, say, 2002 to 2004, unless another recession hits or some sort of legislation, bankruptcy legislation comes along. Well, that concludes our look at bankruptcy filings in Kansas. For more statistical information and other information on bankruptcy, be sure to visit the newsroom section of the ABI website at www.abi.org.